So today we're looking at part 2 of the Lovecraft story, Herbert West Reanimator, and part 2 is called The Plague-Daemon. This was a 6-part series that Lovecraft released in a magazine series. So you couldn't assume that someone had gotten the previous issue. There's all sorts of reasons people read magazine issues out of order. And he was required by the magazine to recap the first story so that someone who just picked up this issue didn't feel completely lost and was able to read it and enjoy it. So if you binge read these, it can feel annoying that he's recapping every time. It's much better to read them one at a time, which is the way that they would have happened in normal life in the way that this was released. And that way the recap sections don't seem quite as obvious because you're actually getting useful recaps from them when you sit there and read through them. So in the first one, the main character and the narrator who's telling the story are college students, and they try to reanimate a dead body, and it goes wrong, and the dead body apparently wakes up and goes running off into the distance, and the house burns down. But they don't really think about it. In the second story, it's also being told from a point 16 years in the future. So we know that these people survive at least 16 years. And now they're looking back to right after they graduated. So it's just a little bit like a year and a half later in the storyline that they're looking back when they had just graduated, and now there's a pandemic going through the world that the college is in. And it's interesting because up until now, most people who have read this would not really understand the nature of a pandemic. We're in a sense now able to better understand what people going through a pandemic might have felt and dealt with, since we just had to deal with one ourselves. So they talk about the noxious effete from the halls of Eblis. Typhoid stalked leeringly through Arkham. So this typhoid disease comes sweeping through the college, and it's killing off people left and right. We get some recap in here about how the main character and his best friend were trying to reanimate dead bodies and killing off cats and dogs and monkeys and all sorts of things in their progress. And a person who stood in their way was Dr. Halsey, who is the main person in the college and who said, I just don't want you killing off people, killing off monkeys and cats and dogs and trying to see if you could possibly reanimate them. So he's the one who put the stop to the work. And it didn't matter in the end because this plague came through and everything else that they were working on just got thrown to the wind. And now all of them, including all the students and all the teachers and doctors and everything else, were trying to help people who had pandemic issues and trying to save them. And it was really hard because the pandemic was pretty nasty and they were having people die left and right. And the main character, Herbert West, is sad because all this time he's wanted dead bodies to be able to work with, and now there's dead bodies all over, but he doesn't want to work on them because he's too busy trying to do his job that he should be doing, which is trying to save the living ones and not doing experiments on the dead ones. So there's all sorts of burials without embalming made in rapid succession. And everyone is sitting there trying to save as many people as they can. And there was hot summer air, so the corpses were decaying pretty quickly anyway. So it was not really conducive to being able to work with the dead bodies if you were going to be doing some sorts of strange experiments. So the peak of the epidemic happened in August. West, the main character of the story, and the narrator were almost dead through their efforts trying to save everyone, and Dr. Halsey did actually die on August 14th. So there was a hasty funeral on the 15th, and everyone was very sad because he was a great doctor and he had done all sorts of things to try to save people, even people that were past saving. He did his best to help everyone else. And so they had a funeral for him, and they entombed him, and they all went out to the bar, and most of the students went home after that, but West and the narrator decided to make a night of it, and then West's landlady saw them arrive at his room about 2 in the morning with a third man between them, and they looked like they were having a good time. And then at 3 a.m., so only an hour later, the whole house was aroused because they heard all sorts of screaming and noises, and when they get there, the 2 students are all beaten and scratched, and something has jumped out the window and leapt down 2 stories. And there were garments in the room, but West, when he wakes up, burns them and says that they might have germs on them. So this is the state of police operations back then. Some sort of wild thing has happened, and he just burns all the evidence. And he says, oh, please don't try to track him down because he was just a person from the bar that we liked. But we don't remember anything at all about this person from the bar. And mysteriously, the landlady doesn't remember what he looks like, and no one from the bar remembers what he looks like. There is like no evidence at all of what this person that beat them up possibly looked like. And at the very exact same time, someone killed a watchman in the cemetery, and then someone starts killing all sorts of other people in town. And no one makes this connection that there's this crazy person that beat up the two students and jumped out the window and now is going around murdering all sorts of people in very savage ways. 17 maimed and shapeless remnants of bodies left behind by a voiceless, sadistic monster that crept abroad. It was white and like a malformed ape or anthropomorphic fiend. It ate some of the bodies, and eventually they are able to corner it and catch it, and they shot it, but not fatally. They just shot it enough to be able to take it down, to be able to gather it up, and they take it to the local hospital, and they realize that it was a man, despite the nauseous eyes, the voiceless simianism, and the demonic savagery. So they clean it up and they bring it to the asylum. It doesn't even talk about like they put it on trial or anything else. They just cart it directly to the asylum and put it in a padded cell for 16 years until the recent mishap. So now we're starting to get some hints about why this is being written 16 years later and what might have happened. In the previous story, we heard about a dead body that they tried to reanimate and that ran off, and that was 17 years in the past. Now we've got 16 years in the past where this mysterious monkey-like creature is going around eating people and killing people, and seems to be related to the person that they brought home with them together that no one recognized. But when they describe it now, they say that the monster's face had a mocking, unbelievable resemblance to the learned and self-sacrificing martyr who had been tombed but 3 days before, the late Ellen Halsey, public benefactor and dean of the medical school of Miskatonic University. So they are talking about it the next morning, the two college students, and West mutters through his bandages, "Damn it, it wasn't quite fresh enough." So clearly he was trying to get his hands on Dr. Halsey. He didn't think it was quite fresh enough. He didn't get to it early enough. But no one in the entire village, even though they know that this guy was just buried and that this thing looks exactly like him, and I mean, they could go to the grave and try to dig it up and say, oh, look, there's no one in the grave. How could that possibly be? And it doesn't sound like these two people are hiding anything they did. You know, they brought the guy up with them. Surely someone saw them if they, they didn't carry him in a canvas bag, which they had done with the previous one. It sounds like they just carried him on each shoulder and pretend that he was a drunk friend or something like that. So surely people would have seen him doing that and seen that he looked like the doctor. So lots of very questionable things. Now, we could say that this is just a fantasy horror story and we have to just suspend our disbelief for all of this. But there's only a certain amount of suspension of disbelief in here that I can go through before I start to just lose the train of thought. And in terms of, this has to be a cliffhanger, because the magazine people want someone to get through all 6 episodes and keep reading and reading them. But is this really a cliffhanger? We know that there is a pandemic and that the person in charge of the school died from the pandemic, and that these 2 students dug him up and tried to bring him back to life, and apparently did bring him back to life, except in a way that he goes around killing and eating people. And then the guy's response to this is, it wasn't quite fresh enough. I suppose the question is, what happened 16 years later that caused something that involves the first body that they managed to wake up but was just screaming, and then the second body that woke up and was now a cannibal. Something must happen between those 2 things in 16 years. But again, that seems so far in the distance, and I don't know anything about the narrator. to really care about him, except that he's a mindless, loyal minion to the main character. And I don't have any sense of caring about West and what he's doing, because he just seems to be an emotionless clod who wants to go around digging up bodies and trying to inject them with things to see what happens to them. So I'm sort of hoping at this point that the monsters win and kill them, or kill the main character. I suppose we feel a little bit of sympathy for the narrator character. But it doesn't feel like a horror story to me. It feels like a justified revenge story. But again, it's good to read these and pause in between them and think about what is going on and hopefully get some semblance of interest in what the characters are doing. And it's also important to remember that this was the 1920s, and these are some of the first mentions of scientific zombies that are out there. So for people who haven't been immersed in zombie stories all the time, this was a new and frightening kind of thing to consider happening. Nowadays, with zombies being everywhere, it's like, oh yes, more zombies. Stupid college kids doing stupid experiments and injecting things that they shouldn't be doing. What would they do anything different, because they're sitting there drinking all night long and thinking, oh, I wonder what would happen if I injected that into my instructor. Wouldn't that teach him a lesson? So it's a interesting story in some ways, but I am just not getting that drawn into it. I guess we will keep reading and see what happens next. Of course, I know what happens because I've read these all a couple times to prepare for this. But even reading this on the first time, I get to the end of this, it's like I'm just not drawn to keep reading. But we will. We will see what happens and get our way through the very first zombie story with scientific zombie creators. And, that counts for something. So let me know your thoughts on this.